There are moments in life when time seems to pause, when the world stands still, and you find yourself face to face with a stranger who, in some inexplicable way, feels familiar. It's as though the universe whispers a quiet invitation, offering a glimpse of something deeper, a connection not yet formed, but inevitable. Emmy had never believed in fate. To her, life was a series of choices, paths carefully constructed by reason and effort. Love, she thought, was no different. It was something you earned, something built slowly over time, like one of the intricate stories she wove with her words. Palmer, on the other hand, had once been a dreamer. He believed in serendipity, in the power of the unseen forces that brought people together. But the years had hardened his heart, teaching him that even the most beautiful dreams could crumble, leaving behind only empty echoes of what might have been. And yet, on a quiet afternoon in an art gallery, their worlds collided. Two souls, shaped by the weight of their pasts, unknowingly took the first step towards a story neither had been expecting, a story of love, loss, and the cracks that reveal who we truly are when everything else falls away. This is their story. Chapter 1: A Fateful Encounter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the large glass windows of the art gallery, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Emmy stood still in front of a massive oil painting, her deep eyes fixed on the swirling, chaotic colors that seemed to dance across the canvas. To her, the wild, powerful, and yet broken strokes of the brush felt like a reflection of her own soul, fiery but fractured. Emmy was a writer, an intelligent, proud woman who had endured her share of heartache. She longed for a love that was real and lasting, but every relationship in her past had left her disillusioned. Now she found herself here, standing amidst these works of art, wondering if she was searching for something unattainable. On the opposite side of the room stood Palmer, silent and alone, his gaze sharp yet pensive. He wasn't particularly interested in the paintings around him. He had come to the gallery as a way to escape the relentless pressures of his life. As a successful architect, Palmer had achieved much, but nothing could fill the deep void inside him. He had loved before, and he had lost. His past was full of pain, and it was something he had never truly escaped. And then, in that moment, his eyes fell on Emmy. She stood there, lost in thought, radiating a quiet strength, but there was a vulnerability in her posture that captivated him. It wasn't her physical beauty that drew Palmer in. It was something deeper. A kind of unspoken connection, an invisible thread that seemed to tie them together in that instant. Emmy, though unaware of Palmer at first, soon felt the weight of his gaze. She turned, and their eyes met across the room. The exchange was brief but powerful, stirring something within both of them. In Palmer's eyes, Emmy saw something she recognized, a loneliness, a silent suffering, just like her own. Without thinking, Palmer moved toward her, his feet almost pulling him forward. "Do you like this painting?" he asked, his voice calm and gentle. Emmy, slightly surprised by the sudden approach, turned her attention back to the painting. She gave a slight nod. "It's intense but fragile at the same time," she replied, her voice soft, her eyes lingering on the jagged brushstrokes. Palmer raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. "Like people. We seem strong on the outside, but it only takes a small crack for everything to fall apart." His words struck a chord with Emmy. She turned to face Palmer, studying him for the first time. He was tall, with eyes that were cool and gray, yet they held a depth of emotion that intrigued her. There was something about Palmer that made her feel both drawn to and wary of him. "Do you really believe that?" Palmer's gaze met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something unspoken between them. "I think everyone has cracks. We just don't like others to see them." The conversation between them flowed naturally after that, as though they were old friends rediscovering one another after years apart. Emmy couldn't pinpoint what it was that made her open up to him so easily. Perhaps it was the way he spoke about life, or perhaps it was the way his voice seemed to resonate with her own unspoken thoughts. Whatever it was, it felt effortless. They wandered through the gallery together, exploring the rest of the paintings, each one sparking a new conversation. Palmer, normally reserved and introverted, found himself completely at ease in Emmy's presence. She wasn't like any woman he had met before. Emmy didn't try to impress him. She was simply herself, intelligent, charming, and wonderfully complex. As the afternoon faded into evening, they eventually decided it was time to leave. Palmer offered to drive Emmy home, and after a moment of hesitation, she agreed. On the drive, they continued their conversation, moving from art to life, to dreams and unfulfilled desires. Palmer found himself captivated by Emmy's idealism, her drive, and the hint of sadness that lingered behind her bright smile. Emmy in turn sensed that Palmer was a man full of secrets, deep and hidden, yet incredibly sincere in the way he listened to her. When Palmer's car came to a stop outside Emmy's home, he turned to her. "Thank you for this afternoon. I didn't expect to have such a good conversation." Emmy smiled, a soft, genuine smile that warmed Palmer in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. "I should be thanking you. I didn't think I'd meet anyone as interesting as you." Palmer said nothing more, just nodded. But inside, something had shifted. A strange, hopeful feeling had begun to stir within him, one that he couldn't quite name. Emmy stepped out of the car, her heart beating faster than usual. There was something about Palmer she couldn't quite place, but she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of a much longer story, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take her. Chapter 2. The cracks begin to show. The days following their encounter at the gallery were filled with small moments of discovery. Palmer and Emmy exchanged numbers that evening, and what started as a casual exchange of texts soon became something more. They spoke nearly every day, sharing little details of their lives, bits of humor, and fragments of their inner worlds. For Palmer, these conversations were a welcome distraction from the high-stakes demands of his architectural projects. His work had consumed him for years, leaving little room for personal connections. But with Emmy, he felt something shift. She wasn't just an escape. She was someone who understood him in a way no one else had. There was an ease to their communication, a flow that felt natural, even as it stirred emotions he hadn't expected to feel again. Emmy, on the other hand, approached this new connection with cautious optimism. She had learned long ago that vulnerability could be dangerous. Her previous relationships had taught her that men, even those who seemed sincere, could disappoint. But there was something different about Palmer, something quiet and genuine. He didn't bombard her with attention, didn't try to rush things, and that, in itself, was refreshing. It wasn't long before they met for their first real date. It was a simple dinner at a cozy restaurant downtown, a place Emmy had always wanted to try. The ambiance was warm, filled with soft candlelight and the murmur of quiet conversations. Emmy arrived first, her heart racing slightly as she waited for Palmer to walk through the door. When he finally arrived, she couldn't help but notice the way the light caught his features, strong, yet somehow softened by the evening. As he approached, Palmer smiled, that same quiet, confident smile that had drawn her in from the start. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice steady but with a warmth that made Emmy's heart skip a beat. "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing ever so slightly. "You're not too bad yourself." The evening passed with ease. They talked about their work, their passions, and the small things that made them tick. Emmy spoke about her writing, how the stories she created were often born from a deep sense of longing, of wanting to understand the complexities of love and human connection. Palmer listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers, genuinely captivated by the way she spoke. In turn, Palmer opened up about his work. He explained how architecture for him was more than just constructing buildings. It was about creating spaces that shaped how people lived, how they felt, and how they interacted with the world around them. His passion for his craft was evident in every word, and Emmy found herself drawn to the depth of his dedication. As the night wore on, they laughed and shared more than just facts about their lives. They shared glimpses of their fears, their dreams, and the things that kept them awake at night. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect evening, there were cracks. Small, but present nonetheless. At one point during dinner, as Palmer told a story about a childhood memory, Emmy noticed a brief flicker of something in his eyes. It was a flash of pain, quickly concealed, but enough to catch her attention. She didn't press him, but the moment stayed with her. She wondered what it was that he was holding back. Everyone had their secrets, after all. Later, when the conversation shifted to relationships, Emmy found herself hesitating. Palmer had asked her a simple question about her past, whether she had been in love before. It wasn't an invasive question, but for Emmy, it felt like a door opening to a part of herself she wasn't ready to reveal. Her past relationships were a mess of disappointment and heartache, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to revisit that just yet. "I've had my share of relationships," she finally said, her tone more guarded than before. "But love, real love, I'm not sure I've found it yet." Palmer sensed the shift in her demeanor, and though he didn't push, he could feel the weight of something unsaid hanging between them. It was a reminder that, despite the connection they felt, there were still parts of each other they hadn't yet explored, places that were off limits, at least for now. As the evening drew to a close, Palmer walked Emmy to her car. The night air was cool, and the city streets were quiet. They stood together for a moment, the warmth of their earlier conversation lingering between them. "I had a great time tonight," Palmer said, his voice soft but sincere. "So did I," Emmy replied, though there was a part of her that still felt conflicted, unsure of where this was going and whether she was ready for it. Before she could think too much about it, Palmer leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle, almost tentative kiss, as though he was testing the waters. Emmy's heart raced, and for a brief moment she let herself get lost in the feeling. But as soon as it began, she pulled away. Not abruptly, but enough to create a space between them. Palmer looked at her, searching her eyes for an answer, but Emmy simply smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good night, Palmer," she whispered, turning to unlock her car door. "Good night, Emmy," he replied, stepping back as she climbed into the driver's seat. As Emmy drove away, the streets blurring past her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was already shifting between them. Palmer was kind, thoughtful, and easy to talk to. But was that enough? Or was there something deeper, something unresolved, that she was afraid to confront? Palmer watched her car disappear into the night, his mind racing with thoughts of their evening together. Emmy had captivated him in ways he hadn't expected, but there was something in her that felt just out of reach. He couldn't help but wonder if she, like him, was holding back, afraid of what might happen if they let themselves fall too deeply too quickly. For now, they were both content to keep their walls intact, but the cracks had already begun to show. Chapter 3. Hidden Scars. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of emotions for both Palmer and Emmy. They continued to see each other regularly, but as their connection deepened, so did the complexities of their feelings. The chemistry between them was undeniable, but there was an invisible barrier that neither could fully break through. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. They would meet for dinner, take long walks in the city, and talk about everything from work to their favorite books. But there were moments, fleeting but significant, when a silence would fall between them, heavy and uncomfortable. It wasn't the comforting kind of silence that came from familiarity. It was the kind that hinted at something unspoken, lurking beneath the surface. One evening, they decided to take a drive out of the city. Palmer suggested a quiet spot by the lake, a place he often visited when he needed to clear his mind. Emmy agreed, curious to see this part of Palmer's world that he had yet to share with her. The drive was peaceful at first, the rhythmic hum of the car creating a sense of calm. But as they left the city behind, Emmy felt a growing tension. She had sensed it before, but now it was becoming harder to ignore, the feeling that Palmer was holding something back, something significant. She wanted to ask him, to dig deeper, but a part of her hesitated. What if she uncovered something she wasn't ready to face? As they pulled up to the lake, the setting sun painted the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The water was still, reflecting the colors of the sky like a mirror. It was beautiful, peaceful, but the tension between them lingered. Palmer stepped out of the car first, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Emmy followed, her eyes drifting from the scenery to Palmer. She could see the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched ever so slightly. He was trying to keep something hidden, and she could feel it in the air between them. "Palmer," Emmy said softly, stepping closer to him. "Is everything okay?" Palmer didn't answer right away. His eyes remained on the lake, as if searching for the right words. Finally he sighed, his voice low. "There are things I haven't told you." Emmy's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of things?" He turned to her, his expression serious, almost pained. "About my past. about why I'm the way I am. Emmy's breath caught in her throat. She had sensed there was something he wasn't telling her, but hearing him say it aloud made it real. You can tell me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Palmer looked as though he might open up, might finally let her in. But then, just as quickly, he turned away, his walls slamming back into place. It's complicated, he muttered. I'm not sure you'd understand. Emmy felt a wave of frustration rising within her. She had been patient, giving Palmer space, but this constant push and pull was wearing on her. How can I understand if you don't tell me? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Palmer's jaw tightened. Because some things are better left in the past. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Emmy stared at him, trying to make sense of his reluctance. She knew everyone had their scars, their secrets, but Palmer's resistance was starting to feel like a wall she couldn't climb. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, she said quietly, her voice softening. But if we're going to keep seeing each other, I need to know what's going on inside your head. Palmer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as though trying to relieve the tension. I've been hurt before, Emmy, he admitted finally, in ways that changed me. Emmy's heart softened at his admission. We've all been hurt, she said gently. But that doesn't mean we have to stay broken. Palmer turned to her, his eyes dark with emotion. I don't want to hurt you. The rawness in his voice surprised her, but it also deepened her resolve. Then don't, she said simply. Let me in. Let me help you. But Palmer's expression remained conflicted, torn between the desire to open up and the instinct to protect himself. I'm not sure I can, he whispered. The admission hung in the air like a fragile promise, and Emmy felt the sting of uncertainty settle deep within her chest. She wanted to believe that Palmer would let her in, that he would trust her with the parts of himself he kept hidden. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he never would. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. English version. The days following their conversation at the lake were a strange mix of intimacy and distance. Palmer and Emmy continued to see each other, but something had shifted. The cracks in their relationship, which had been subtle before, were now more visible, and each interaction seemed to carry an undercurrent of tension. For Emmy, Palmer's reluctance to open up had planted a seed of doubt. She wanted to believe that they could build something meaningful together, but the more he held back, the harder it became to ignore the growing distance between them. Every time she tried to get closer, to understand the parts of him he kept hidden, Palmer would retreat, leaving her feeling as though she were chasing a shadow. Palmer, too, felt the weight of their unspoken conflicts. He cared deeply for Emmy, more than he had for anyone in years, but the thought of letting her into his past terrified him. There were things he wasn't ready to confront, memories he had buried long ago. And yet he knew that by keeping her at arm's length, he was slowly pushing her away. One evening, Emmy invited Palmer to her apartment for dinner. It was a quiet evening, with candles flickering softly on the table and the smell of homemade pasta filling the air. Emmy had spent the day preparing the meal, hoping that a calm, intimate setting might encourage Palmer to open up, to finally let her in. Palmer arrived, bringing with him a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Emmy noticed it immediately, the tension in his posture, the guarded look in his gaze. Still, she pushed her concerns aside, determined to make the night as pleasant as possible. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily at first. They talked about work, about the book Emmy was writing, and about a recent architectural project Palmer had been working on. But as the night wore on, the conversation took a more serious turn. So, Emmy began cautiously, setting down her glass of wine. Have you thought any more about what we talked about by the lake? Palmer stiffened slightly, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. I've thought about it, he replied, his tone carefully neutral. And? Emmy pressed gently. Do you want to talk about it? Palmer hesitated, the tension in the air thickening. He set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes avoiding Emmy's. It's not that simple, Emmy, he said after a long pause. There are things in my past that I'm not ready to talk about. Emmy felt a pang of frustration, but she kept her voice calm. I understand that, she said. But if we're going to have a real relationship, Palmer, I need to know who you are, what you've been through. I'm not asking for every detail, but I can't keep feeling like there's this wall between us. Palmer's jaw tightened, his gaze still fixed on the table. I don't know if I can do that, he muttered. Emmy stared at him, her heart sinking. She had hoped that tonight would be different, that Palmer would finally trust her enough to share the parts of himself he had been hiding. But instead, it felt like they were back where they started, with the same wall between them. I can't keep doing this, Palmer, Emmy said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. I can't keep waiting for you to let me in when you keep pushing me away. Palmer's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or fear. I don't want to hurt you, Emmy, he said quietly. But I don't know how to give you what you're asking for. Emmy looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass. I'm not asking for perfection, she whispered. I just want honesty. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Palmer's mind raced, torn between his desire to keep Emmy in his life and his fear of what might happen if he let her too close. He knew that by staying silent, he was hurting her. But the idea of confronting his past, of sharing his pain, felt impossible. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I don't know how to do this. Emmy looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and understanding. She had always known that Palmer was carrying something heavy, but hearing him admit it, hearing the fear in his voice, made it all the more real. Maybe, she said softly. You don't have to do it alone. Palmer's breath caught in his throat. The offer was simple, but it was more than he felt capable of accepting. He had spent so long keeping his pain to himself, building walls to protect the parts of him that were broken. The thought of letting someone else in, of allowing Emmy to see those scars, was terrifying. I need time, he said quietly. Emmy nodded, though the ache in her chest was hard to ignore. I can give you time, she replied. But I can't wait forever, Palmer. The words hung in the air like a quiet warning. Emmy wasn't issuing an ultimatum, but she needed him to understand that she couldn't keep waiting indefinitely for him to open up. She had her own wounds, her own fears, and being with someone who couldn't or wouldn't let her in was beginning to take its toll. As the evening drew to a close, Palmer kissed Emmy goodbye at her door, the gesture filled with a tenderness that belied the tension between them. But as she watched him walk away, Emmy couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that they were standing on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong step could send everything crashing down. Chapter 5, Breaking Point English Version. The days following their dinner were fraught with tension. Palmer and Emmy continued their routine of seeing each other, but the ease and warmth that once defined their relationship had vanished. Now every interaction seemed to be tinged with a subtle wariness, as if both were waiting for the other to make a move, to say something that would either heal or break them further. Emmy tried to remain patient. She understood that Palmer needed time, that trust was something he struggled with. But each day that passed without him opening up felt like another brick being added to the wall between them. She found herself questioning everything: his intentions, his feelings for her, and even her own ability to handle the relationship's mounting strain. It all came to a head one stormy Friday evening. Palmer had promised to meet Emmy for dinner at a restaurant downtown, a small, cozy place they'd discovered together a few weeks ago. Emmy had arrived early, taking a seat near the window, watching the rain pour down in thick sheets outside. She checked her phone, noting that Palmer was already 15 minutes late. As the minutes ticked by, Emmy's frustration grew. She had tried so hard to be understanding, to give Palmer the space he needed, but tonight, the weight of their unresolved issues pressed heavily on her. After 30 minutes, Palmer still hadn't arrived, and Emmy's patience had reached its limit. She called him, her fingers shaking slightly as she waited for him to pick up. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Finally, on the third try, Palmer picked up, his voice hurried and distracted. Hey, I'm sorry, he said, his words rushed. I'm caught up with something at work. Caught up with something? Emmy's voice was sharp, cutting through the sound of the rain outside. Palmer, we had plans, You didn't even call to let me know you were going to be late." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Palmer spoke again, his tone was defensive. "I told you. I'm busy. I can't just drop everything." Emmy closed her eyes, fighting back the rising wave of anger. "It's not just about tonight, Palmer," she said quietly, her voice tight. "It's about everything. I've been patient, I've tried to understand, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep waiting for you to let me in." Palmer sighed, the sound of it crackling through the phone. "I told you I need time." "And I've given you time," Emmy shot back. "But how much longer, Palmer? How much longer am I supposed to wait for you to decide that I'm worth trusting?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. There was a long silence on the other end, and for a moment Emmy thought Palmer had hung up. But then he spoke, his voice low and distant. "I don't know if I can give you what you want, Emmy." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She had feared this moment, the moment when Palmer would finally admit what she had been dreading, that he might never be able to give her the trust and openness she so desperately needed from him. But hearing it out loud was far worse than she had imagined. "You don't know," she repeated softly, more to herself than to him. "So what are we doing, Palmer? Are we just wasting time?" Another pause, and then Palmer's voice, filled with frustration. "I'm trying, Emmy. I'm trying to be what you want, but it's not that easy for me. You don't understand." "Then help me understand." Emmy's voice broke, the frustration and hurt she had been holding back for so long spilling out. "I'm here, Palmer. I've been here, waiting, hoping that you'd trust me enough to let me in, but you keep pushing me away, and I'm starting to think that maybe you'll never stop." The raw emotion in her voice hung in the air, and for the first time, Palmer felt the full weight of what he had been doing to her. He had been so caught up in his own fears and insecurities that he hadn't truly considered the toll it was taking on Emmy. He cared for her, deeply, but the thought of letting her into his most vulnerable parts still terrified him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice strained with guilt. "I don't know how to fix this." Emmy took a deep breath, her heart aching. "I don't know if you can," she said softly, her words filled with sadness. "I love you, Palmer, but I can't keep being the only one fighting for us." There was another heavy silence, and Emmy felt the weight of her own words settling between them like a final blow. She had said it, the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. She loved him, but love alone wasn't enough to fix what was broken between them. "I need to go," Palmer said quietly. I need to think." Emmy nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Take care of yourself, Palmer." She ended the call and sat there, staring out at the rain that continued to pour relentlessly against the window. Her chest felt hollow, as if the fight had drained all the energy out of her. She had tried so hard, but there was only so much she could do. At some point, Palmer would have to meet her halfway, or they would have to let go. As the rain fell harder, Emmy realized that the choice wasn't just Palmer's to make. She, too, would have to decide how much more she was willing to endure, and whether holding on to a love that couldn't grow was worth the pain it caused. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The days after that fateful phone call felt like a fog for both Palmer and Emmy. Neither had reached out, and an uncomfortable, heavy silence filled the space where their relationship had once thrived. Emmy had hoped that Palmer would come to her, that he would realize the gravity of what she had said. But with each passing day, the silence grew louder, a reminder that perhaps she had been asking for something he was unable, or unwilling, to give. Palmer, on the other hand, was struggling with his own inner demons. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at a distance, of building walls that kept him safe from being hurt again. But with Emmy, everything felt different. He had never cared about someone as much as he cared about her, and that was precisely what terrified him. The closer she got, the more vulnerable he felt, and the more his past loomed over him like a storm cloud, threatening to ruin everything. One evening, as Palmer sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, he found himself staring at the small box he had hidden away in the back of his closet for years. Inside were remnants of a life he had long tried to forget, a photograph, a letter, a ring. Each object was a reminder of the pain he had buried deep within himself, a reminder of why he had sworn never to let anyone in again. But Emmy was different. She made him want to believe that he could be loved again, that he could trust again. Yet every time he thought about opening up to her, the fear crept back in, telling him that she deserved better than the broken man he had become. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. He wanted to call her, to explain everything, to let her know that it wasn't her fault. None of this was. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat there, paralyzed by indecision, as the minutes stretched into hours. Meanwhile, Emmy was fighting her own battle. Her heart ached for Palmer, but she knew she couldn't keep waiting forever. She had given him space, hoping that he would take the time to reflect and come back to her with answers. But now, the silence felt like an answer in itself. The absence of communication, the lack of effort, it all spoke louder than words ever could. One afternoon, Emmy found herself wandering through the city, aimlessly walking through streets filled with people, each one a reminder of the life she had envisioned with Palmer. As she passed by a small park, she sat down on a bench and watched as couples strolled by, hand in hand, their laughter and affection seeming so effortless. She couldn't help but wonder why it had to be so difficult with Palmer. Why, despite their connection and the depth of their feelings, they couldn't seem to break through the walls he had built around himself. Part of her wanted to keep fighting, to hold on to the hope that he would eventually let her in. But another part of her, the part that had grown weary from months of emotional strain, was starting to think that maybe it was time to let go. As Emmy sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Her heart leapt as she pulled it out, hoping it was Palmer. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank. It was just a message from a friend. Palmer had still not reached out. The weight of that realization settled heavily in her chest. How long could she keep waiting for a man who might never be ready? How long could she put her own needs and desires on hold in the hopes that he would one day change? That evening, Emmy found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She didn't recognize the woman looking back at her, someone who had been so full of life and optimism but had slowly become consumed by doubt and uncertainty. She missed the version of herself who wasn't constantly questioning her worth, who wasn't always waiting for someone else to decide if she was worth fighting for. For the first time in weeks, Emmy let herself cry. She cried for the love she had given so freely, for the effort she had poured into a relationship that seemed to be slipping away. She cried for the man she loved, who was so trapped by his own pain that he couldn't see the life they could build together. But mostly, she cried for herself, for the pieces of her that had been chipped away, bit by bit, by the weight of trying to carry a relationship that seemed doomed to collapse under its own silence. The next day, Emmy made a decision. She had spent enough time waiting, enough time hoping that Palmer would come around. She loved him deeply, but love wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed trust, openness, and vulnerability. And if Palmer wasn't ready to give her that, then she had to be ready to let him go. That evening, Emmy sent Palmer a message. It was simple, but the words were heavy with finality. "Palmer, we need to talk. I can't keep waiting like this." Palmer received the message late that night, just as he was about to go to bed. His heart pounded as he read her words, the weight of them sinking in like a stone. He knew this moment was coming, that Emmy wouldn't wait forever. But seeing it in writing, knowing that she was finally reaching her breaking point, shook him to his core. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the message for what felt like an eternity. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to bury himself deeper into the safety of his solitude. But another part of him, the part that loved Emmy, that longed to be the man she needed, knew that this was his last chance. Palmer took a deep breath and typed out a response, his hands trembling slightly as he hit send. "You're right, we need to talk. Can we meet tomorrow?" As the message sent, Palmer felt a strange mixture of relief and fear wash over him. He knew that the conversation they were about to have could change everything. And as much as he wanted to avoid it, he knew that avoiding Emmy, avoiding the truth, was no longer an option. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. The next evening, Emmy arrived at the small cafe where she and Palmer had agreed to meet. It was a quiet, cozy place, tucked away on a side street, the kind of cafe that felt like a world apart from the noise of the city. She had chosen it because it had once been one of their favorite spots, a place where they had shared many moments of laughter and warmth. But tonight, it felt different. Colder, somehow. The weight of what they were about to discuss made the air feel heavier. She sat at a corner table, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, cycling through every possible outcome of this conversation. Would Palmer finally open up to her? Would he push her away once again? And what would she do if he did? Emmy's heart raced as the minutes ticked by. She checked her phone. Palmer was late. Her stomach twisted in knots as she wondered if he would show up at all. But just as doubt began to creep in, she saw him walk through the door. Palmer looked tired, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a kind of restless energy. His eyes met Emmy's across the room, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he made his way to the table and sat down across from her. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but strained. "Hi," Emmy replied, her voice equally quiet. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence between them, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. They both knew why they were here, but neither wanted to be the first to dive into the difficult conversation they both feared. Finally, Emmy broke the silence. "Palmer, we can't keep doing this." Her words hung in the air like a final verdict. Palmer nodded slowly, his eyes downcast, but he didn't respond. "Every time we talk, it feels like we're getting further apart," Emmy continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I keep trying to reach you, but it's like you're slipping away. I love you, Palmer, but I can't be the only one fighting for this relationship. I need to know where you stand, what you want." Palmer took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing Emmy say it out loud made it all the more real. His chest tightened with the weight of everything he had been holding back, but he knew that this time, he couldn't run from the truth. "I know," Palmer said quietly. "I know I've been distant, and I know it's not fair to you." Emmy's eyes softened, but she remained guarded, waiting for him to continue. "I want to give you everything you're asking for," Palmer said, his voice low. "But I don't know if I can. I've been carrying so much for so long, and it's hard for me to trust, to let someone in." Emmy leaned forward slightly, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "But I'm not just someone, Palmer. I'm here because I love you. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm just asking you to be honest with me, to let me in." Palmer looked up at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emmy saw the raw emotion in his eyes. It was as if the walls he had built around himself were finally starting to crack. "I've been afraid," Palmer admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that if I let you see the real me, the parts of me that are broken, that you'll walk away. That you'll realize I'm not enough." The confession hit Emmy like a wave. It was the first time Palmer had ever come close to acknowledging the depth of his fears. She reached out across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Palmer," she said softly, "I already know you're not perfect. And that's okay. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for you. For the real you, not the version of yourself you think I want." Palmer's hand tightened around hers, but his eyes were filled with uncertainty. "I don't know how to do that, Emmy. I don't know how to let go of the fear." Emmy's heart broke a little at his words, but she held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. "You don't have to do it all at once," she said gently. "We can figure it out together, but you have to try. You have to want this as much as I do." For a long moment, Palmer didn't say anything. He looked down at their joined hands, his mind racing. He wanted to be the man Emmy deserved. But part of him still felt trapped by the shadows of his past. The thought of opening up terrified him, but the thought of losing Emmy was even worse. "I do want this," Palmer finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want you, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to give you what you need." Emmy swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment of truth. She had been waiting for Palmer to say those words, but now that he had, the reality of what it meant hit her full force. He was admitting that he might never be able to change, that the walls he had built might be too strong to tear down. "I can't keep waiting forever." Emmy said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. I love you, Palmer, but I can't put my life on hold while you figure out if you're ready to be in this relationship. I need someone who's all in. Palmer's heart sank at her words, but he knew she was right. He had been asking her to wait, to be patient, while he struggled with his own fears. But now he realized that he might have been asking for something that wasn't fair. I'm sorry, Palmer said, his voice breaking slightly. I never wanted to hurt you. Emmy squeezed his hand one last time before letting go. I know you didn't, she said softly, but sometimes love isn't enough. The words felt like a dagger in both their hearts, but Emmy knew they needed to be said. She had been holding on to the hope that Palmer would change, that he would let her in. But now she realized that she couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of a relationship that might never be what she needed. I think we need some time apart, Emmy said, her voice trembling. Maybe that's what you need to figure things out, but I can't keep living in this limbo, Palmer. Palmer nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had always feared this moment, but now that it was here, he realized that maybe it was for the best. He needed to face his fears, to confront the parts of himself he had been avoiding for so long. I understand, Palmer said quietly. I don't want to lose you, but I understand. Emmy felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She didn't want this to be the end, but she also knew she couldn't keep waiting for something that might never come. Take care of yourself, Palmer, she said softly as she stood up from the table. You too, Palmer replied, his voice thick with emotion. As Emmy walked out of the cafe, a sense of finality settled over her. She had fought for this relationship, had given everything she had, but now it was time to let go. At least for now. Palmer watched her leave, his heart aching with the realization that he might have just lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. But as painful as it was, he knew this was the wake-up call he needed. Now, it was up to him to decide whether he would finally face his fears or let them define him forever. Chapter 8. Fractured Paths. The days following their conversation passed in a blur for both Palmer and Emmy. It was as though time had become irrelevant, stretched out in front of them like an endless road with no clear destination. For the first time in years, they were living separate lives, no longer intertwined in the way they had once been. And yet the ghost of their relationship lingered in every moment, haunting them both. Palmer woke up each morning to an unbearable silence. The quiet of his apartment had always been a comfort, a sanctuary where he could retreat from the world. But now, it felt suffocating. Every corner of his space reminded him of Emmy, the books she'd left on his shelf, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to his couch. He had once been able to convince himself that he could live without her, that keeping his distance was a way of protecting himself. But now that she was truly gone, he realized just how much of himself he had given to her without even knowing it. One night, after another sleepless stretch of hours, Palmer found himself staring at his phone. Emmy's number was still at the top of his call log, a reminder of how easy it would be to reach out to her. His finger hovered over her name, the desire to hear her voice pulling at him like a gravitational force. But he knew that calling her now would only make things worse. He had to give her the space she had asked for, no matter how much it hurt. Instead, Palmer threw on a jacket and left his apartment, hoping that a late-night walk might clear his head. The city was quieter than usual, the streets nearly empty, save for a few stragglers making their way home. As he wandered aimlessly through the familiar streets, Palmer's mind drifted back to the conversation they'd had at the cafe. Emmy's words echoed in his mind, a constant refrain, I can't keep waiting forever. She had been right, of course. He had been asking too much of her, expecting her to stay while he figured out his own issues. And now that she was gone, he was forced to confront the truth that he had been avoiding for so long. He had been afraid to let her in because he was terrified of losing her. And in the end, that fear had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. As Palmer walked, he found himself at the edge of the park where they had once spent lazy afternoons together, sitting on the grass, talking about everything and nothing. He stopped in front of the bench they used to sit on, his chest tightening with the weight of memories. He sat down, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he let the emotions he had been suppressing rise to the surface. The grief, the regret, the love he still felt for Emmy, it all came pouring out in waves. Meanwhile, Emmy was doing her best to move forward, but every step felt like an uphill battle. She had thrown herself into work, filling her days with meetings, projects, and deadlines, anything to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how busy she kept herself, there were always quiet moments when the reality of her situation would hit her like a ton of bricks. She missed Palmer more than she cared to admit. She missed his voice, his touch, the way he made her feel safe, even when everything else in the world seemed uncertain. But she also knew that she had made the right decision. She couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness, her own emotional needs for the sake of a relationship that wasn't giving her what she deserved. Still, the emptiness he left behind was hard to ignore. Emmy had never realized just how much space Palmer had taken up in her life until he was no longer there. Every morning, she would instinctively check her phone, half expecting a message from him, only to be met with silence. It was as though a part of her had been severed, and she was still trying to figure out how to live without it. One afternoon, Emmy found herself wandering through a bookstore, searching for a distraction. She absent-mindedly browsed the shelves, picking up books, reading the blurbs, but nothing seemed to hold her attention. Her mind kept drifting back to Palmer, to the way things had been between them before everything had started to unravel. She found herself standing in front of the poetry section, where she had once bought Palmer a book of poems, something she thought would speak to the quieter, more reflective side of him. As she flipped through the pages of a book, a poem caught her eye. A few simple lines about love and loss, about the spaces people leave behind when they go. The words hit her harder than she expected, and before she knew it, tears were welling up in her eyes. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed by her sudden emotion, but the truth was undeniable. She wasn't as okay as she had been pretending to be. That evening, Emmy sat in her apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. The world outside seemed to be moving on without her, while she was still stuck, replaying the same moments over and over in her mind. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Palmer's contact. Part of her wanted to call him, to tell him that she missed him, that she was willing to try again if he was. But she stopped herself. "I need someone who's all in." Those had been her words, and she knew she couldn't back down now. Palmer had to be the one to take that step, to show her that he was ready to be in this relationship fully. She had done everything she could, and now the next move was his to make. Palmer, on the other hand, was coming to the same realization. He had spent so much of his life running from his feelings, from his fears, that he hadn't realized how much damage he had caused along the way. But now, with Emmy gone, he was forced to confront the truth about himself. He was scared of being vulnerable, scared of being hurt, but he was also scared of losing the one person who had made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be loved for who he truly was. As Palmer sat in the park staring up at the night sky, he made a decision. He couldn't keep running forever. If he wanted to have any chance of getting Emmy back, he would have to face the things he had been avoiding for so long. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to try. The next morning, Palmer called his therapist, someone he hadn't seen in years. He knew that if he was going to make things right with Emmy, he needed to start by making things right with himself. And that meant confronting the fears and insecurities that had been holding him back for so long. Meanwhile, Emmy was trying to rebuild her life, piece by piece. She had always been strong, independent, but loving. Palmer had shown her how much she had been willing to compromise for the sake of a relationship. Now she was learning how to put herself first again, how to find happiness on her own terms. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that things between her and Palmer weren't over yet. There was still a part of her that believed in him, that believed he could change, but whether or not that belief would be enough to bring them back together remained to be seen. Chapter 9. Steps Toward Healing. Palmer sat in the waiting room of his therapist's office, his leg bouncing nervously as he stared at the floor. The familiar ache of discomfort settled into his chest. This was a place he hadn't been in years, not since before he'd met Emmy. He had convinced himself that he didn't need it anymore, that he could handle things on his own. But now, sitting here, he realized how much he had been lying to himself. The door opened, and his therapist, Dr. Ryan, stepped out. She smiled warmly when she saw him, though her eyes betrayed the surprise of seeing a former patient after such a long absence. "Palmer," she greeted, gesturing for him to come inside. "It's been a while." "Yeah, it has," Palmer muttered as he stepped into the familiar office. The air smelled the same, faintly of lavender, and the soft lighting created a sense of calm that he sorely needed. He sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of everything he had been carrying for so long pressing down on him. Dr. Ryan sat across from him, her expression open and patient. "So, what's brought you back?" Palmer leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and ran a hand through his hair. Where to even begin? The words stuck in his throat, but he knew this was his only chance to finally say the things he had been avoiding for years. "I messed up," Palmer said, his voice low. "I pushed away the one person who really cared about me, and now I don't know how to fix it." Dr. Ryan nodded but didn't interrupt. She knew Palmer well enough to understand that this admission had been a long time coming. "I've been afraid," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Afraid of letting someone in, of letting Emmy in. Every time things got too serious, too close, I just shut down. I thought it was easier to keep her at a distance. But now that she's gone, I realize I've been running from myself this whole time." The room was quiet for a moment, as Dr. Ryan let Palmer's words settle. She took a deep breath before responding. "Fear of vulnerability is something a lot of people struggle with, Palmer. It's not easy to let someone see the parts of ourselves that we're not proud of. But you're here now, and that's a big step. So, let's start by talking about what you've been running from." Palmer hesitated, the familiar walls rising in his mind, but he knew they had to come down if he was going to make any real progress. So slowly he began to open up, about the things he had buried, the fears that had shaped his actions, and the way his childhood had left him afraid of intimacy, afraid of being hurt. For the first time in years, Palmer felt like he was beginning to untangle the knots inside him. It wasn't easy. Each session left him emotionally exhausted, but it also left him with a sense of relief he hadn't felt in a long time. He was starting to understand that the walls he had built to protect himself had also imprisoned him. And if he wanted any chance of getting Emmy back, he had to tear them down, piece by piece. While Palmer was working on himself, Emmy was grappling with her own emotions. She had thrown herself into her life, doing everything she could to keep busy, but it was impossible to escape the memories of Palmer. She missed him deeply. But at the same time, she was determined not to lose herself in the process of loving someone who wasn't ready to fully commit. One evening, Emmy found herself sitting on her couch, a cup of tea in her hands, staring at the stack of photos she had taken over the years. Palmer was in so many of them, smiling, laughing, looking at her in that way that used to make her feel like the center of his universe. She traced her finger along the edge of one photo, the memory of that day washing over her. They had been so happy then, so full of hope for the future. But now, things were different. She had given Palmer everything she could, but she had also learned that love wasn't enough if it wasn't reciprocated in the way she needed. She had to find her own happiness, her own sense of fulfillment, outside of their relationship. Yet, even with that realization, the thought of never seeing Palmer again, never holding him, never sharing their quiet moments together, it was almost too much to bear. As Emmy sat there, lost in thought, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down and saw a message from Palmer. Her heart skipped a beat, a mix of hope and anxiety flooding her. She hadn't expected him to reach out. Not yet. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between them. "I'm working on myself. I want to be better. I miss you." Emmy stared at the message, her emotions swirling in a confusing storm. A part of her wanted to reply immediately, to tell him that she missed him too, that she wanted to try again, but another part of her held back. She had promised herself that she wouldn't go back unless things were different, unless Palmer had truly changed. And so, instead of replying, Emmy put the phone down and leaned back on the couch, letting her emotions settle. She knew this was a turning point. Palmer was trying, and that meant something. But she also knew that she needed more than just words. She needed to see action, to know that Palmer was ready to be in this relationship fully, without reservations. Palmer, on the other hand, was slowly coming to terms with the depth of the work he had to do. Therapy was helping him unearth parts of himself that he had long ignored, parts that had been shaped by years of unresolved pain and fear. He was learning how to sit with his emotions instead of running from them, how to communicate instead of shutting down. But despite his progress, Palmer knew that the real test would be whether he could show up for Emmy in a way that she deserved. He had let her down before, and the thought of losing her for good terrified him. But he also understood that rushing back into her life without being truly ready would only hurt them both in the long run. One evening, after a particularly intense therapy session, Palmer sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. His mind was full of everything he wanted to say to Emmy. How sorry he was, how much he missed her, how he was trying to become the man she needed him to be. But as he started to write, the words didn't come out the way he had hoped. Instead of writing a letter, Palmer found himself sketching, a habit he had abandoned years ago. Drawing had always been a way for him to express himself when words failed, and now, as he let the pencil move across the paper, he began to capture the emotions he had been holding inside. The image that emerged was raw and unfiltered, a reflection of his own journey, the struggles, the growth, and the hope that he might one day be whole again. As Palmer sat back and looked at the sketch, he realized that this was the first time in a long time that he had allowed himself to be vulnerable. And it wasn't just for Emmy. It was for himself too. The next day, Palmer sent Emmy the drawing, along with a short note. "I'm still a work in progress, but I'm trying. I hope one day we can talk." When Emmy received the drawing, she was surprised. It wasn't the kind of message she had expected from Palmer, but somehow it felt more honest, more real than any words could have been. She stared at the sketch for a long time, her heart torn between the love she still felt for him and the uncertainty of their future. But something about the drawing, the rawness of it, the vulnerability it showed, touched her in a way that no apology or explanation ever could. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. Weeks passed since Palmer sent the drawing to Emmy. The silence between them had been unnerving, but also necessary. Palmer understood that Emmy needed time to process everything, just as he needed time to fully embrace the changes he was making within himself. The therapy sessions had become a cornerstone of his life, guiding him through the difficult process of confronting his fears and insecurities. He was learning to let go of the past, to stop allowing it to dictate his present. And more importantly, he was learning how to be vulnerable, to express his emotions instead of shutting down. But the question that lingered in the back of his mind was whether it was all too late for him and Emmy. Meanwhile, Emmy had been on her own journey of healing and reflection. Palmer's drawing had touched her deeply, showing her a side of him that she hadn't seen before. A side that wasn't afraid to admit his flaws. She had spent many nights staring at the sketch, wondering if she was ready to let him back into her life. It wasn't that she didn't still love him. She did. But love, as she had learned, wasn't enough on its own. Trust, communication, and mutual commitment were the foundations of a lasting relationship, and Palmer had to prove to her that he could provide those things. And she had to be honest with herself about what she truly needed. No more compromises, no more waiting around for someone to change. One afternoon, while sitting at a cafe near her apartment, Emmy found herself writing a letter to Palmer. She hadn't planned to, but the words just flowed out of her, as if they had been waiting for the right moment. "Palmer, I've spent a lot of time thinking about us, about what went wrong, and why it hurt so much when we fell apart. I know you've been working on yourself, and I respect that more than I can say. It's something I always hoped you'd do, for your own sake as much as for ours. But I also need to be honest with you. I can't go back to what we were before. I won't go back to being someone who compromises her own happiness for the sake of keeping the peace. I need a partner who is willing to meet me halfway, who is all in, the way I am. I won't settle for less anymore. That said, I miss you. I miss the way we laughed together. The way you made me feel safe when things were good between us. I haven't forgotten the good times, even if they feel far away now. I don't know where this leaves us, but I think we owe it to ourselves to talk. Maybe things have changed, maybe they haven't, but I want to hear from you, truly hear you, and decide where we go from here. Emmy. The letter was short, but it said everything Emmy needed to say. She folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope, feeling a mixture of apprehension and hope. Sending this letter wasn't just about Palmer, it was about reclaiming her own voice, her own power in the relationship. 2 days later, Palmer received Emmy's letter. His heart raced as he tore open the envelope, reading her words slowly, taking in every sentence. She hadn't shut him out completely. There was still a chance, a glimmer of hope that they might find their way back to each other. But this time, Palmer knew it wasn't just about winning her back. He had to show her that he was ready, that he had changed in ways that would make their relationship stronger, healthier. This time, he had to be the one to step up. Without wasting another day, Palmer called Emmy. His hands trembled as the phone rang, and he half expected her not to pick up. But after the third ring, she answered. Hello? Her voice was soft, tentative, as though she too was unsure of where this conversation would lead. Emmy, Palmer said, his throat dry. I got your letter. There was a pause on the other end, and then Emmy spoke, her tone steady. I meant what I said, Palmer. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I know, Palmer replied, and I don't either. I want something better for both of us. They arranged to meet later that week, at the same park where they had shared so many memories, where they had once laughed, cried, and dreamed together. Palmer arrived early, sitting on the same bench where he had once faced the painful realization of his mistakes. This time, though, he felt different. He felt ready. Emmy arrived a few minutes later, her presence like a soft breeze, carrying both familiarity and uncertainty. She approached the bench slowly, her expression unreadable, and Palmer stood to greet her. Hi, she said, her voice warm but cautious. Hi, Palmer echoed, a nervous smile tugging at his lips. They sat down, an awkward silence hanging between them for a moment. Palmer glanced at Emmy, taking in the way her hair caught the sunlight, the way her eyes seemed to carry both the weight of their past and the hope for something new. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Palmer began, his voice steady but vulnerable. About everything. About us, about what went wrong. I know I messed up, and I know I hurt you. I didn't let you in the way I should have, and I didn't give you the commitment you deserved. But I've been working on that. I've been in therapy, and I'm learning how to stop running from things that scare me. Emmy listened, her face softening slightly, though her guard was still up. That's good, Palmer. I'm glad you're working on yourself. Palmer nodded, taking a deep breath. I don't expect you to forgive me just because I'm trying. I know I have to show you that I've changed, and that's going to take time. But I want to be better, for you and for myself. I want to be the kind of person who can be in this relationship fully, without holding back. Emmy's eyes flickered with emotion, but she remained quiet, letting him continue. I miss you, Palmer said, his voice softer now. I miss us. And I don't want to lose you. But I also understand if you need more time or if you don't want to give this another shot. I just wanted you to know that I'm all in this time. Whatever happens next, I'm ready for it. For a long moment, Emmy said nothing. She looked out at the park, watching a group of children play in the distance. Her mind was racing, torn between the love she still felt for Palmer and the fear of being hurt again. But as she sat there, she realized that Palmer was different. He wasn't making empty promises or grand gestures. He was being honest, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. And that vulnerability was what she had been waiting for all along. I miss you too, Emmy finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. And I believe you when you say you've changed. But I need to see it. I need to know that this isn't just talk. Palmer nodded, relief and determination flooding his chest. You will, he promised. I'll show you. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the weight of their conversation settling over them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of hope. As the sun began to set, Casting a warm glow over the park, Palmer reached out, tentatively taking Emmy's hand in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently, a small smile playing on her lips. "Let's take this slow," Emmy said softly. "One step at a time." Palmer smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of hope. One step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, they both felt that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other.